I had some notes saying that Rome wasn't built in a day, and even ACH and card took years to become widespread used. So we have to be patient. We have actually, I think we're on an accelerated rate compared to where those started out 50 years ago. I remember having my first credit card. We didn't have Visa or MasterCard available. We had just ExxonMobil and Macy's, and we had either store-specific cards or we had oil cards, and they were private things. You only used that at those locations, and then they sent you a bill and you paid it. Then came along open card networks with Visa and MasterCard with all the banks and the American Express as well.
Welcome in, everybody. You're listening to Wrestling Payments, a podcast where we help payment professionals contend with the challenges of modernizing their payments operations and identifying ways to build for the future. If you're interested in payments innovation and modernization, you're in the right place. Now, let's get into it.
Hello and welcome to an excellent episode of Wrestling Payments. This is a topic that I love. It's the #1 downloaded episode on our website. When we talked about ISO, we're back again to talk about ISO with an expert. Steve, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, hi, I'm Steve Wasserman. I've been in payments now for many years, involved from a couple of different aspects. I had been involved from the ERP and interfacing corporates in their banks for many years in one of my startup companies that was a consulting firm, but dealt with a lot of ERP companies. And then another space was in the walk-in bill payment space, which is another startup that I had. Both of those ended up being Inc. 500 companies that you might see behind me. Then I got into payments, learning more about the modern versions of payments when I took a course from MIT on future commerce and fintech. And it's been a while back. I joined the Faster Payments Council, been involved in many different work groups on the board of directors now. So met many people like Joe and others through a number of different things that I've been involved in, including the Faster Payments Professional Program that we've both been involved in.
And I knew Steve from being in the room, working on those projects, but could you back up for a second? On the wall, can you hit that again? What are we looking at?
So the first company was a consulting firm that we partnered and did a lot of work with one of the mid-tier ERP companies. And we ended up selling that company to that ERP company when we were like the #1 third-party provider to do extensions to their ERP and do customizations. So, and a lot of it had to do with doing payments for their corporates that were their corporate clients. So that was one of them. That was an Inc. 500. We grew that company pretty quickly in the first several years. While we had that business, though, but we had this company was called In-Person Payments when we started it. It later on changed its name to Softgate Systems, got acquired by a company called TO Networks. TO Networks ended up selling the company to PayPal for $300 million. Whoa. But I had gotten out of it before the acquisition by TO, but I did well in both of those.
Very nice.
It's been a great journey. Learned a lot about business-to-business payments as well as consumer payments because we had to deal with a lot of bill pay and doing real-time top-ups. Doing the prepaid products that within seconds, the money that you would give cash for, you had access to on a card to use it anywhere the card was accepted. We were doing that over 20 years ago.
Wow. Wow. That was very ahead of its time, I think, right?
It was. I like to think that some of the things we did in that industry of basically alternative financial services turned into, that was before the term fintech existed, because this was in the early 90s. We started pre-internet and pre-Windows. We had dial-up and DOS, but obviously we adapted over time and, took on the internet and took on a lot of partners as we grew through the internet and enabled us to take on a lot of partners that we developed APIs to interface with them. So it was a great experience.
Wow. And APIs were new back then, right?
They were, I know. And even XML was kind of, new at the time. So we were getting involved in all the things that structured and started to establish some standards for, of which we're going to talk about. One of the emerging standards we are very relevant through Faster Payments for ISO 2022.
That was an excellent segue. So let's talk about that for a minute. And I have to tell you, I have a pet peeve. My pet peeve is that whenever someone talks about ISO 20, I call it 20022. People say it 20022. But I have a pet peeve. My pet peeve is the minute you're in a session or someone starts to talk about it, they go over the cliffs really fast, and they're talking about formats and standards and the data elements. And Steve mentioned a book. So this, and we were going to talk about this later, but Smart Instant Payments, there's a chapter in here written by Steve that talks about ISO 20022, and not one format is explained. It really gives you a great oversight of ISO, or overview of ISO 20022. I know we were going to talk about this later. Do you want to just mention the book and we can dig down deeper later?
Sure. I'll show my copy. I got my copy right here too. We all got our copies.
Yeah.
And this is, if you're in, you want to do things with payments, especially instant payments, this is a great primer. And as well, but it goes beyond primer. So it can address multiple levels. What we'd love is for everybody in the industry to be able to be familiar with this, as well as the next generation of subject matter experts, people in business schools and so forth. They're the ones who could really benefit from getting this basically foundation, understanding instant payments. But we also talk about in the book, how do we get there? There's a whole history chapter as well. And I had been the editor across all the chapters and wrote some of the chapters as well, one of which was the ISO chapter that I had some expertise on. So Great book. Make sure you can get it on Amazon.
And you can get it from us. We were so interested. We bought a bunch. We're selling them at a discount. It's so funny. It's the first time I've looked at a book cover and said, hey, I know him. Hey, I know her. Hey, I know him. That's
a good point. It wasn't just me. I was together with, I think, 6 or 8 other industry experts that we met through the Faster Payments Council. The ones originally was from the clearinghouse, now it's in another location. But we had people from the Federal Reserve, and they had several others that we met through the Faster Payments Council, including Reed Lieutenant, who's the executive director.
Excellent. All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Let's talk. I've been hearing for a few years now, ISO 20022. It's going to change everything. Can you talk a little bit about why it's getting so much press?
Well, it's really because it's an emerging standard globally, not just in the U.S. I mean, in the U.S., it's relatively new, but outside the U.S., it's been around for decades. But here in the U.S., we're probably more familiar about how it's initially being used in NOW and RTP. Those leverage that standard for all the messaging. But we have coming up in 2025, the clearinghouses CHIPS and the Federal Reserve FedWire. They are adopting ISO 20022. SWIFT has adopted it, and in the UK, like things like CHAPS. So, and instant payments across the world and other payment platforms as well have adopted ISO 2022 because it's a language of financial transaction terminology, and it has a really great dictionary of terms that you can use over and over again to describe some of the things in a very structured way with self-describing XML format, so that it's very easy to ingest and basically understand, machine learning, understand very quickly and be able to use for automation and other, many different purposes. Some other functionality of it is that because it has a lot of rich data and has, certain types of information that we don't see in other payment platforms. For instance, like the different types of parties that it can talk about. Most of them just talk about the payer and the payee. They term those the creditor and the debtor. Those are the parties that are sending or receiving the money. But there's also an ultimate creditor and debtor, that it could be the party that the transaction is being done on behalf of, who's sending the money, or the person that is receiving the money on behalf of some other party. So it could be third parties involved there. And even beyond that, there could even be, when they get to like B2B payments, you have invoicers and invoicees, or even bill pay in general. Those could be other parties that not necessarily the same as the creditor or debtor, or even the ultimate creditor or debtor, So that's a flexibility you don't have in any of the other message standards. That's a key thing for the payer, payee, and all the associated people to them. Then you have the FI and the information about the FI, the sending and receiving FI, but there could also be the funding sending and receiving FI involved in it, and that information is available in the message structure for you to be able to describe. So it's very comprehensive messaging that you get with lots of information. Some of the other types of information involve like structured remittance. So, everybody says, well, it's great that you can send me electronic payment instantly, but what'd you pay for? And that remittance detail, you could do it either structured or unstructured, but structured is much better because the receiver of the payment, especially if it's a business, is able to then automate that for straight through processing. And that's an important capability. There are other capabilities in the standard that provide additional data, such as request for payment. Is a transaction that our current, we do request for payment outside of the payment network right now, but here it allows you to do it inside the payment network and integrate it with the turning around and taking in a request for payment and turn it into a push payment. And in the
Can we
U.S.,
pause there for a second? So just if someone's trying to catch up, payments are sent right now using, let's say instant payments for a minute. Instant payments are credits. In the US, FedNow or RTP, both of those send a payment. So you have the players that you talked about, and they can send a credit. There is no debit. There is no someone sending a debit to take the money out of the account. So how does the request for payment solve that?
well, the request for payment is a substitute for the debit. So instead of the funds being pulled from the account that's going to be debited, you request the payment and that person approves, or that person or party approves the transaction, and that then triggers sending the payment or scheduling the payment, because it doesn't have to be, the request for payment say, when's it due? So now I could schedule it to be up to the last second it's due.
Last second, right.
Really plan for, well, let's see, today's the end of the day of Friday. If I don't get it in time, and Monday's a holiday, I got to plan for the funds to get there Tuesday. Well, if I do instant payments, no, it'll get there in less than 30 seconds, regardless of the day of the week or the holiday or anything like that.
And if I was going to argue with you, I was going to say, well, the U.S. already has, EDI, right? EDI is a standard. Why do we have to change to this ISO?
Well, I'm glad you bring up EDI. I mean, I've used EDI in many, electronic transaction exchanges for business to business. I've been doing that for decades. EDI is a great standard. Its implementation, though, had lots of different dialects and different ways to use it. So, and it wasn't self-describing, so it's not as easily digestible as the XML format of ISO 2022. And you had to worry about the version, and there are things called loops, a lot of things that could vary. And you had to use translators and mappers for EDI, additional software to make it translated to or from the version that you would understand. And many times it was translating, sometimes it would translate it to or from even just a CSV file that some of the businesses just basically had to generate or receive a CSV file because the systems couldn't necessarily ingest or create the ISO, complicated ISO format that required.
That touches on two really, I try to tie things people are wrestling with in payments as much as possible. That really ties to the you mentioned earlier, the straight through processing and the XML. For folks who don't know XML, websites are built in HTML. And if you looked at a heading, for example, on a website, it's surrounded by little brackets with an H1 maybe, heading 1, and the end of it is a slash heading 1. So it tells you, hey, the thing between these two symbols is the heading. XML does the same thing. So it'll say debtor, and it'll tell you debtor, here's the person's name, end of the debtor. So it's readable. I remember, you probably remember too, maybe around 2010, the Fed went on this road trip where they sold a product called Fed EDI. And what it literally did in a system where they were trying to put EDI in an ACH record, this system took it out of the ACH record, printed it out onto a form, and sent it to the person. So as far as straight-through processing, it totally bypassed straight-through processing. I mean, the intent is you get the file, your computer says, oh, thank you very much. Who paid? Oh, their bill's paid? Great, their bill's paid. So that, you don't have all those intermediary steps, someplace someone can make a mistake, right?
Yeah. And so the thing is to understand when you have businesses that need to originate payments or receive payments, remittance information and all that, they may already be doing that using EDI. And there's a lot of B2B services that'll be able to leverage using the standard of ISO to either create the message that they came from EDI to ISO or from ISO to EDI, so that the existing business customer can already interface now ISO 202 behind the scenes using their existing technology, which might be EDI or even a spreadsheet, as I said, that they have integrated already into their systems to either create or receive and process for straight-through processing.
Let's talk a little bit about why this is such a challenge. And I was on the Faster Payments Council with you. I learned of the other geographies that were already doing this, already using ISO 20022 to do it. It was all new for me back then. This is around 2015. And, all of a sudden, RTP said, hey, we're going to offer a faster payment solution. The Fed said, you know what? After this research and after what we've heard from the industry, we're going to do a faster payment system. At the same time, using ISO 20022, at the same time, SWIFT was sort of going through their own evolution, and they decided the same thing. They were going to, and this word, I hear it a lot. From a definition, it means just make things work together. It's orchestration, right? Make payment systems work better together. So,
well, when everybody is using the ISO standard, at least between the financial institutions, and eventually corporates might be able to adapt it as well, or adopt it, or at least be able to integrate to and from it, as I described. When that happens, now global interoperability is more capable. Now, there are different implementations of using the standard. Even, FedNow and RTP have some minor differences. But all in all, those are minor compared to the widely varied differences you might have seen back in the days of using EDI. And, not ACH was always a very good standard. There weren't really many ways to change it around, though I have run into implementations where they said, well, in this identification field, we want this value. So with the different implementations, they get interpreted on the use of specific fields. But it was a very structured, but limited format. Unless you got to the addenda, that was all free form. Mm-hmm. But you could even, include in that addenda. NEACH has talked about being able to even include an ISO 2022 broken up into 80-character chunks, in the addenda, to carry the information like for remittance, et cetera.
I do know NEACH jumped on that. I do also know that they're revisiting it right now. So in a world where you have two new payment systems, RTP and FedNow, you have chips that has converted to ISO 20022, and FedNow is right now in the middle of a conversion from, I think it was a proprietary system over an ISO 20022 standard. As a payment professional, do I have to jump on board? What do I have to know about this ISO? Because, what if I say it's new, I don't want to know anything more? Why would you disagree with that, and why?
Well, you need to learn more about it because of these other capabilities it enables that allow you to now plan ahead for the future. Initially, you want to just be compatible with send and receive basic transactions. But when you start using some of the extensible data that it has that, go beyond what the current, standards that are being used, like NEACH. ISO 8583 has a level 3 data, but how many people really use it?
And
Some do.
For the audience, what is ISO 8583?
ISO 8583 is the messaging standard used for all the card transactions in the U.S. and actually globally. So we want this to be able to use for all the instant and payments globally and create interoperability, between them. So that's what ISO, kind of enables.
Interestingly, and I really don't know much about wire, but if I understood wire, the data in wire was kind of generally in a place on a wire transfer. Whereas if you're replacing that with, ISO 20022, you're always going to know what the company name is. You're always going to know who the sender is because what was the standard for wire? Was it something MT?
Well, MT, I know that, Swift had MT and their MT to ISO 202 conversions. And then going back in the other way, in the other direction too, from ISO 2 back to MT, depending. So you want to be able to at least support interfacing to and from what you readily can handle now, but also then start to learn more about ISO because there are other things you can do with it that you couldn't do with the MT, or you couldn't do with ACH, or you couldn't do with other card products as well.
Super interesting. What do you think the biggest obstacles to adoption? Because from the rumor mill or from a little bird told me this wire transfer implementation is there's a little bit of struggling going on in the industry. Don't share anything you shouldn't share, but there's a lot of folks behind, and as far as we know, there is a deadline. That deadline is March of next year. The Fed's flipping a switch, and if your system can't send an ISO 20022 wire, you're not sending wires.
Well, you may end up sending it through a fintech that already provides you the conversion.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, and then this is why you need to learn about ISO to say, okay, well, that'll be my stopgap measure, but, figure out from how ISO is going to allow you to do more than just, send the wire. Well, I want to send the wire along with, if it's a business to business, along the remittance detail. I want to communicate, these additional parties involved that I couldn't do possibly before. So those are the things you want to learn. And there's a lot of things about the structure of ISO 2022 that lend itself more for automated processing. So you can enable automated processing for you and your treasury clients and other clients that want to leverage that information. And some of the information that includes, for instance, that additional information can help you with your compliance requirements. It can help with fraud detection and mitigation with having that additional information. So there's a lot of other benefits that you get from that extended data that you're otherwise having to research these outside the payment. Well, if that data is inside the payment, now your systems are much more effective and ideally, handle, doing fraud detection and doing compliance more on a real-time basis.
Right. I do see that. I do get that. And would you agree that it really is just formatting the data in a better way, a more usable way? I mean, it could be as simple as that. No.
Well, it also, I'm going to raise another technology, thing that this can really take advantage of it. If you now are processing transactions using ISO 2022 and you have filled in additional data, this is where AI can really be helpful to give you that real-time fraud detection, to do some real-time compliance reporting or triggering or detecting AML and all that, doing it all in real time. I talked about that book and payments business, and when we went online, we had to do real-time AML checks.
Wow.
We couldn't, because the person's there standing paying for the transaction right then and there, and we had to say, hey, wait a minute, no, we need you to fill out a CTR, not a CTR, but CTR was over $10,000, but an SAR, and a form would pop up and they had to type in that information. If they walked away, we kind of noted, well, we didn't process the transaction, but we noted that this is something suspicious. And when they gave us the information, we obviously had to comply with, submitting that to the appropriate authorities.
Super interesting. I can't imagine the first day someone said, "Oh, by the way, you have to do this compliance as well." And everyone going, "We have to what?" Amazing.
But usually that's happening sometimes after the fact. Somebody does a large transaction, and now, somebody in the compliance department of the bank is saying, "Hey, here's a transaction we got to investigate." Well, if the data is already all there, that investigation can happen. Some of it, real time.
Yeah, it is amazing.
Or at least trigger it better, for an automated workflow.
It is an amazing time in payments. I'm looking at my book. I'm going to pick my book up again. So I spent many, many years listening to people talk about instant payments, talking about faster payments, and it was sort of amazing to see the core of what folks should know in this book, right? All those presentations are pretty much included in here. And I got to tell you, your chapter, I generally knew about ISO. When I was in those sessions where they started talking about the format of the PAX 08, I glazed over a little. Your chapter, what a good job. It talks about where it came from. What are some of the pieces that are important to those payments, the PAX, the pain, without going into the fourth field on the second record is this data. It's like just phenomenal. How just from a curiosity perspective, how did you decide that was the way you were formatting it? I mean, I just noticed you have the card format here. That's why I asked the 8583.
Well, I did a comparison between, ISO 202, 8583, as well as with against ACH. So, that was relevant to people to know about it. They don't need to know the nitty gritty details of it. That we leave the engineers to do that type of work. We need to know functionally what can we do with it, and that's why it's meant for executives as well as people in product to be able to learn these things in the banks and in the payment companies and fintechs and as well as the next generation of them, as I said, for people in the business schools. That's the place that ISO 2022, they'll say that'll be the standard by the time they're fully engaged in their life history and so forth.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. It's things are so, I don't know, maybe it's not moving so fast. Maybe I'm just old, but I didn't have a cell phone. Yeah. I didn't have a cell phone when I was in college. With all this technology today, what's it going to be like in 10 years? Do you think this is not in the script? What do you think ACH will do with ISO 20022? Will it just make it able to send an ISO, or do you think there could be another ACH network?
Well, I had a vision for, I didn't share this in any of the previous correspondence with you, but I called it Anytime ACH. And Anytime ACH is being able to use the same format we use today and basically send it through an API where I take a batch and I split it up by RDFI if I'm originating it and send out the batch of data specific to AV RDFI. And then there's a net amount that's corresponding to. And I turn around and use a FI to FI instant payment between the two organizations to settle that ACH batch that I sent to that, or between ODFI and RDFI.
Now in 2000, I would think that's pretty impossible. But in 2024, not so impossible, right?
It's all about the rules.
Yeah.
It's the technology is not holding it back.
Definitely not. And it's hard to, sometimes I think if you're new to this, it's hard to get your head around it. But if you brought it down to what you just said, there's two parts to it. There's a message and then there's settlement, right? And the message was Let's send them, here's the ACH. I want to send it anytime. API, hey, API, click, done, paid.
Well, some of the big banks been doing that for a long time, just between themselves. But they didn't have to. They weren't necessarily using APIs. But my design is to do that, and you could use instant payments for the settlement, or we get to like a wholesale digital currency, which is something else that I had in another startup that I started a company called VMents that is a digital currency issued by banks, and it basically has an oversight entity like NACHA or the Federal Reserve that sets the rules, actually has some, sets the controls for usage, enables bank accounts being attached to it or not. So it can address even an ecosystem that includes financially inclusive people that I used to serve in the walk-in payments business. I did a lot of prepaid equipment, so they could have accounts that could be less KYC or even anonymous if it were gift card equivalent, but then is limited to maybe $500. That's it in one time. Whereas reloadable prepaid, I forget the exact limit, but a couple $1,000. But you could reload it, and then you would try to. Then you had limits on the daily activity as well.
Payments are so interesting. Given that we were off the script on that.
Yeah,
one.
we got off.
Patents pending. This is Steve's ideas. Don't hijack them. I'm looking at our notes again, and I don't think something we haven't really touched on, which I think is fascinating. Were you at the Berlin meeting? I don't recall the Berlin Payments Alliance meeting. They talked about UPI in India and how their payments are working. Can you talk a little bit about how ISO 20022 affects maybe AI you touched on, codes? Does it help with embedded banking or open banking? Directories going to help with all this?
Well, that's the thing you're talking. Now you're starting to talk about another chapter I wrote about. I called them instant payment rocket boosters. That's the title of that chapter, and it covers AI, QR codes, directories, which directory models group. We're working on a hackathon for that coming up soon. For a what's gonna help the instant payments is being able to have an alias directory to say, I want to send something, just like we do with PayPal, Venmo, and Zelle. We want to be able to do an instant payment with an alias as well. So directories are important. QR codes is a way, maybe there's a link to that directory, or QR codes can provide the alias or can provide the credentials itself. A directory kind of works hand in hand with that. But then we leverage AI to make sure everything is properly being vetted and all the information is accurate, as well as triggering reminders and or triggering AML alerts or other alerts, fraud detection, and all that. That's where AI comes in, to all that. So I touch upon a few of those things in that chapter in the book as well. And those are the things that will accelerate the adoption of instant payments. I think some of the other things are holding back the adoption of instant payments. And people have said it's been kind of slow going. Well, I had some notes saying that Rome wasn't built in a day, and even ACH and card took years, to become widespread used. So we have to be patient. We have actually, I think we're on an accelerated rate compared to where those, started out 50 years ago. And, I remember having my first credit card. I'm a bit older than you. My first credit card, we didn't have Visa or MasterCard available. We had just ExxonMobil and Macy's, and we had either store specific cards or we had oil cards, and they were private things. You only use that at those locations, and then they sent you a bill and you paid it. So then came along open card networks with Visa and MasterCard with all the banks, and the American Express as well. Though I'm an American Express holder since 1980. Yeah, I love that. They like me.
Yeah, your picture must be up in their office.
But some of the other reasons back why was it taking so long here for instant payments to be adopted in the U.S. is banks have complicated systems, and they have legacy systems. They're not easy to change, and they can't rip and replace things. They have to find a way to kind of incrementally walk their way into it and be very careful and be risk averse because they can't afford the risk of anything failing. So, that's part of it. But they have the opportunity to plan to create new systems and new platforms that'll take them to the next generation of payments for the next 100 years. And that's the opportunity that then incorporating ISO 2022 and some of these other technologies into this new platform for the future. And I call VMEDs, I call it banking into the future. It's planning, those types of things all coming together. And digital currencies will be part of it too. That'll be the next type of instant payment, is a digital currency payment, but not cryptocurrency. I don't believe that, crypto, unregulated, and even stable coins. This is where, I said VMEDs is kind of addresses that next level of banks doing their equivalent to it. In the industry, they call it now tokenized deposits. But yeah, a lot of other things that, affecting the adoption. One of them is the economics. We don't yet have an economic model for instant payments in the U.S. like we do with the card networks. And obviously we need to come up with something different than interchange and chargebacks, which we shouldn't have as many chargebacks or any chargebacks because it's only credit push.
Credit push?
You have authorized push payments that we were either scammed into or there was account takeover. And that, now there's a lot of focus on how do we control that. The Fed's done a wonderful job of its fraud classifier, and now it has a scam classifier to go with it. So those are resources that you should definitely take advantage of. The book at least talks about the fraud classifier a little bit. The scam classifier is kind of really new. This, I think, weeks old actually. So those are things
published before the scam classifier was done.
Go ahead.
Oh no, you published before the scam classifier was public. So the fraud classifier being included is excellent. And we did it. We just did
those
an
are
episode
invaluable tools. And FedNow requires if you do have some fraud reporting, you need to use their classifiers to structure things for more automated and AI enabled real-time capabilities.
So we're about at time. What would be, and thank you for appearing on this. I would, you mentioned so many things. I kind of want to have you back again to talk a little bit more about them. But if we're sticking directly to the topic of learning more about ISO 20022, what advice would you give people? And, for faster payments, what advice would you give folks learning more about faster payments?
Well, first, read the book, but then also get certified. And then there's the accreditation test coming up in 2025. Become accredited faster payments professionals and start to, plan things in your organizations to properly take advantage of the standard. We probably won't have here in the U.S. what has started to happen in the EU or UK, where they're even mandating things like the structured address has to be broken up differently than we're normally used to having a more unstructured address, or the only structured parts of it were city, state, and zip. That goes beyond their structure. The structured address in ISO 2022 is even more structured than that and has more information. So these are things you need to plan for and prepare for, but it does enable now more automation, more use of AI, more capabilities that we had before. That is the future of where payments are going to. So, that's why it's very important.
Excellent. Anything on faster? What's the next step anyone should learn about faster?
Well, we're starting to see ISO 222 now starting for instant payments, cross-border. And, a lot of other hurdles involved in that. And it kind of, does it involve the intermediaries, all the intermediaries it does, or can some of it be done even through blockchain? So a lot of things going on in the industry to happen there and keep your ear to it because it's changing fast. That's the only thing. The things are going fast and you don't want to find yourself in the rear view mirror. And I used to say, you don't want to become that next blockbuster that goes out of business.
Yeah.
And, especially the smaller banks have to worry about it and to be able to keep up with the demand of, customers, their customers. They may not be talking about that. Why aren't I getting instant payments from you? That's because they're using the alternatives they're using PayPal and Venmo, and maybe they're using Zelle. And if you're not offering, they're using it on some other, your money's going elsewhere. So how long are those deposits going to stay with those banks? They need to get with it, because they'll find themselves that next blockbuster.
Yeah, I learned that along the way, that, well, our customer's not asking for it. Our customer's not asking for it, until they are. And then it's, you're 6 months behind, a year behind in an implementation.
They got to get in front of it.
Yeah.
Got to get in front of it. Oh, that was another thing. Well, look, the book talks about, it's all about the use cases. Okay. So when you do instant payments, well, what am I doing it for? All right. So you got to find a use case that it's specific to. So what are some of the typical use cases? I mean, the number one that comes on, somebody turns on instant payments, they find that their money's coming to and from these digital wallets that they're doing all the payments with. It's like, duh, that's where your money's, money's flowing. But, there's earned wage payouts, immediate payment. There's, getting your loan funds immediately, paying that bill that's the last minute due to get it in on time before you get shut off, or you get, late fees, or paying that credit card bill, before you get those late fees and interest charges, and, get yourself in the hole. That's a very deep hole to dig out of. So these use cases, this goes back to the economics. Don't assume that every use case has to have the same economics. The use case value of having an instant payment could dictate the fees that you may charge or collect. And, people are willing to pay that if it's going to otherwise cause them pain, or to get their money faster. They're willing to pay for that. And so, what do we do with in the U.S.? You have everybody likes to use their cards because they get points. I'm a points junkie myself. I like to use everything and pay everything on points. I get my Hilton points, my Marriott, my airline points, and I use all that. And I have an alternate currency to use when I want to pay for those things. And, what the merchants need to do is provide incentives. If they want to receive the money faster, they have to provide incentives. And to me, the best incentive they can provide is something that brings the customer back to the store. It's like, I'm going to give you now 30% off, whatever, when you come back in the store next time. Maybe that's an example. Maybe that's a bit much. A lot more than your interchange. But however, when you get that customer back in store, that loyalty is invaluable. Getting them to come back. My favorite example, my wife gets Kohl's cash. Right?
Cold cash. Oh,
Kohl's is like a
Kohl's.
Target,
Yeah.
well, just for clothing and well, actually it has a lot of things at Kohl's. And she would have that $10, and she would go back, and before I knew it, she spent $50 or $100.
Yeah.
And then they give another $10 to come back. It keeps going back.
Genius.
Instant
Excellent.
payments, the way you get those, merchant specific loyalty to come back and spend more.
I definitely have to, I just wrote down our points payments, but definitely have to have you come back and talk about this at another time. Maybe we'll do a road show with the other authors.
That'd be great. So
Yeah.
let's mention the other authors.
Yes.
And what they wrote. So Reed Lieutenant wrote the chapter on societal, economic, and philosophical implications. A really great chapter. That's the one that leads out the book. Travis Delaney wrote about implementation strategies and approach for go-to-market for fintechs. Elspeth Bloodgood wrote risk, fraud, and compliance. I told you the chapters I wrote. Kevin Olson wrote about use cases, as did one of our other colleagues from City National Bank wrote another chapter about use cases. And Connie Thien and Peter Davey both wrote about the history of payments, where Peter had that history from the clearinghouse, Connie had it from the Federal Reserve and FedNow. And we had a great cast to cover all those areas. And it was a great experience working with all of them to come up with this book. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Yes. And just from the cover, I don't want to, I've probably been left out before. Sean Rodriguez, I think he did the introduction.
Oh, he did the preface. And he was there from the beginning of instant payments initiative for the Federal Reserve. And Connie was there kind of along with him as well. But they're both retired now. They were only able to participate once they retired in the book. But a great experience and great people involved. And hopefully I didn't leave anybody
one more name. I have Michael Young.
Michael Young, he is the CEO and founder of Photon Commerce, who I work for. And I helped get the book done under it being funded by Michael and Photon. And he helped review some of the content as well. But he's the one who helped make it happen.
Yep. I want to thank them all. I know many of them, all good people, people you like to hang around with. I don't know how you think of authors, but all good people. Thank you for joining. We've got to do this again.
Perhaps I'll see many of you at the Faster Payments Council meeting in Endeavor coming up.
Yep.
Coming up. Look forward to it.
All right.
Thank
you very much.
All right. Thanks.
On behalf of NEACH, your trusted resource in payments, and our guests, I'd like to thank everyone for tuning into the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more about payments innovation and modernization, you can find the Wrestling Payments Podcast on the podcast page of NEACH.org or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. Just search for Wrestling Payments in your podcast app. Thanks for listening.